Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my talk about designing for cognitive disabilities. Big fan of AxCon. I was here last year and it was awesome. So I'm super excited to be here with you this year, chatting about how we can make our experiences more accessible. So before we start, just a little bit about me. I'm a product designer and developer currently working at Shopify. I live in Toronto, Canada. I'm also an accessibility consultant. I like sharing some of my ideas and experiences at conferences, also teach a UX class, but outside of work, I'm a huge plant lover. I am trying to learn how to play tennis. I love horror movies. Like if there's a horror movie that's been released in the last few years, I've probably either seen it or read about it. And I am a piano player trying to like relearn my childhood kind of piano playing skills. So today we're going to be talking about cognitive disabilities and how we can best design for them and make sure that we're making our experiences as accessible as possible to as wide a range of people as possible. We're going to be discussing some strategies, including using simple language, reducing cognitive load, using simple layouts, and testing with a variety of users. Now, these strategies are in no way exhaustive, but there are some pretty common strategies I see come up often in my experiences and are some of, I think, the quickest ways that we can make sure our content is accessible for people with cognitive disabilities. Now, what is a cognitive disability? When I use the word cognitive disability, I'm referring to people who might struggle with cognitive tasks that people who do not have cognitive disabilities might not struggle with. It's a really nebulous term that we use to encompass a wide range of different disabilities. It can look like someone who has ADHD and has problems with memory and focus. It might look like someone who has long COVID and is experiencing some cognitive symptoms, including forgetfulness and trouble processing information. It might look like someone who's aging and experiencing a cognitive decline that might include memory loss. But the important thing to remember is cognitive disabilities is an umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of experiences, and that at some point in our lives, most of us will experience a cognitive disability, whether it's temporary, maybe the result of a concussion, or something that we experience as we age and get older. I'm going to be using a few terms that I'm going to go over before we get started. When I say neurotypical, I'm referring to someone who does not have a cognitive disability and is defined like typically by medical professionals or society as someone whose brain works in a way that's deemed as normal. When we talk about people who are neurodivergent, these are people whose brains functions in ways deemed atypical by medical professionals and society. Like we said earlier, there might be people who deal with attention deficits or deal with more processing time needed for cognitive tasks. Difficulties with mental tasks that a neurotypical person might not struggle with is kind of like the go-to definition of someone who is neurodivergent. We're also going to use terms like WCAG. So when I'm saying WCAG, I'm referring to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is basically a giant aggregation of guidelines, tips, and methods to make sure that the content we produce is accessible as possible for as wide a range of people as possible. And these content guidelines are created by W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, who maintains web standards. It's pretty cool that internationally, designers, developers, product managers, folks involved in this accessibility process are looking at the same list of recommendations and of methods to fix things. So when we're having discussions about accessibility, it really is an international conversation because we're all aiming in the accessibility community to kind of do the same things and provide the same level of access. Cognitive disabilities are by far the most common disabilities that we know of. It's estimated that over 1 billion people have cognitive disabilities. And this number doesn't include folks who, for one reason or another, don't identify as having a cognitive disability. Some reasons might include things like cultural stigma or just not having access to resources to be diagnosed or identified as someone with cognitive disabilities. This number is absolutely massive, but it's also really important to remember that this number is going to grow. And again, it's probably at some point in our lives going to include most of us here. So when it comes to cognitive disabilities, there are some Wiki guidelines that provide kind of pointers and guidelines on how to cater to these experiences. So sometimes these criteria are a little bit difficult to quantify. Like, what is exactly accessible language, right? In a way that we can easily define. These guidelines also tend to be AAA. So there are 3 levels of compliance when it comes to Wiki guidelines. We have single A, double A, and AAA. Single A tends to be the simpler things that are more basic, adding alternative text attributes, having a page title. Double A tends to be a level up from that. It's things like making sure that we have closed captions on videos. And then AAA is a level of compliance, which is not absolutely required, but it is recommended if you're able to do it. It can involve things that are difficult or impossible to do. For example, making sure that your video recordings don't have any background noise is one. Now, that might be impossible to do depending on your location, but whenever possible, it really is amazing if you can adhere to these guidelines. So generally, the level of compliance all organizations should be aiming for in the year 2022 is double A, but AAA is by no means off the table. If it is possible and reasonable for you to adhere to those like guidelines, by all means, like do so. It's just not absolutely essential. So language. Language is the first thing we're going to chat about when it comes to strategies to design for people with cognitive disabilities. One aspect of language that we can use to help people with cognitive disabilities is descriptive page titles. Now, this might seem like a really simple one, but it's absolutely essential to make sure that our pages are easy to understand and navigate for people with cognitive disabilities. It's really helpful to make sure that the title indicates exactly what's on the page and provides like a sufficient amount of detail so that someone who's navigating through the page isn't surprised by anything that they find there. So a great example of descriptive page titles is Wikipedia. The page titles are descriptive of what's on the page. And sometimes we even have subheadings like disambiguations explaining how it's different from slightly similar concepts that are available. On a page level, page titles are really important, but also when we look at like the metadata of the page, we want to make sure that our page titles describe exactly what is on the page so that users don't have to, again, read the entire page to understand. If you are a website with a frequently asked questions page, for example, instead of calling your FAQ page just FAQs, maybe name it FAQs about auto insurance, just to make sure, again, that users are presented with exactly what's going to be on the page and are aware of that before diving into your content. Another aspect of using language to design for cognitive disabilities is making sure that we use simple language. Now, this is one that can be a little bit difficult to quantify, like what is simple language, right? By and large, I think when we have content on a page, we should be aiming for about a grade 8 reading level to make sure that the content is explained in a really straightforward way. But there are examples of like legitimate kinds of information that are difficult for most people to understand. I think a great example of this is the mortgage industry. The mortgage industry is an industry, like whether it's on purpose or not, uses a lot of terms that are inaccessible to the general public. And it's really difficult to access this data, which inevitably leads to large groups of people being left out of getting things like mortgages because they're so difficult to understand. There are some terms that are used in the mortgage industry like amortization, like gross household income, like compound interest, all this stuff that the average person on the street probably wouldn't be able to define to you. So what do we do when we're in those situations as a designer? Now, one thing that we can do is make sure that we're defining things within the context of the page itself. So if you're using an acronym, instead of just throwing it out there, make sure that you actually define what the letters in the acronym mean, perhaps in the body of the text. But sometimes you run into situations where it's more difficult to do that. Say if this difficult term is on a field label. At that point, it becomes helpful to explore options like maybe having a tooltip. So users who need access to that information are able to gain access right within that page. I think as much as possible, we should make sure that definitions to more complex terms are available within the page that we are designing. It's not a great experience for a user to have to go to another tab to research something or have to go somewhere else to find information that is essential for them to finish their interaction with your product. Cognitive load. So cognitive load is another aspect that's really important to consider when we are designing for people with cognitive disabilities. When I say cognitive load, I'm referring to the amount of working memory resources or short-term memory someone is using to kind of interact with your application and to get through the task presented to them. Cognitive load can take a variety of different forms, but one example that I really like to use is looking at field labels. Facebook is an example of this. On their login page, we have fields that instead of having field labels present, they use what we call placeholder or helper text right within the fields themselves, which presents a bit of an issue when it comes to cognitive load and usability. When a user is entering information into fields that use placeholder text or helper text, as they're typing out the information, the helper text disappears and their information shows up. The problem with this is if a user isn't keenly aware of the field that they're filling out, or if they lose attention for a second, it's really easy to forget what information you were being asked for in the first place. So for a user, they'll have to delete this input so that they can then again access information about what the field is supposed to hold in order to finish their process. Now for two fields, maybe it doesn't seem too bad, but when you think about this design pattern being used on a page with multiple fields or a page that asks you a lot of questions, it becomes a really big issue when you have to clear the entire form in order to be able to remember what exactly you were supposed to enter. So this is a really straightforward but important way to make sure that we're reducing cognitive load for folks. Like make it easy for them to access the information that you are looking for on a page. Another example of cognitive load, reducing it, is to give users feedback and cues about their interactions on a page. So a really common example I come across of this is disabled buttons in applications. Now, disabled buttons are very common, but they're also very problematic in that they usually prevent users from getting feedback and cues about information on a page. When we have a disabled button on a page, it almost always prevents the user from entering their input. So basically the user's experience is that they know that they can't submit an application for some reason, but there's usually absolutely no feedback as to why they can't do that. So someone is scouring your form or scouring the page, trying to figure out what mistake they made that makes it so that they are unable to submit what they've just put on the page. Now, at best, this is frustrating. Like at worst, someone leaves your application because they actually cannot figure out how to proceed. So generally, there are very few situations in which I think disabled buttons are actually required. I think they are very overused. But one good example of a situation why a disabled button might be helpful in the interface is this example by Zandrina Pereira. A situation that you could possibly conceivably need a disabled button might be something like you are on a website trying to purchase a ticket. On that website, if you haven't entered a number of tickets, then you can't really add to cart because you don't have any tickets selected, right? So in that case, there is a disabled button, but with that button, there is a tooltip that tells the user exactly why they are not able to submit the input. I think if you decide to use a disabled button, this is probably the best case scenario. Like the user can't submit the input, but they are immediately given a reason as to why this cannot happen. With disabled buttons, a really common issue is that they usually don't have any sort of attribute programmatically that indicates that they're disabled. So for an average disabled button, if a user is using a keyboard to tap through the page, the keyboard focus skips over the disabled button entirely. If a user is using a screen reader to navigate on your page, it's almost as if the disabled button doesn't exist because they're never able to actually land focus to understand that there is a disabled button on a page. Now that is a pretty awful experience. Like not only do they not know why they can't submit the information, but the disable button basically doesn't exist for them. So a good way to fix this is by adding an ARIA disabled attribute that's set to true, just so when the button is disabled, folks using screen readers or keyboards are actually able to interact with it and they know that there's actually a button there. So yeah, this is a great example of making sure that we give users feedback and cues when using elements so that they actually know what's wrong on a page and they can fix it. Now, another really great example of reducing cognitive load for users is enabling them to cut, copy, and paste. Now, Recently, I've come across some applications, whether it's like a banking app that's trying to be secure or a website that asks you to enter a password that disables cut, copy, and paste, kind of, I guess, in the misguided belief that this improves security. But what this actually does is increase the cognitive load required for users to complete that task. So users will have to, instead of cut, copy, and paste, memorize that information to move it over to the location where it needs to be. In other situations, I think this is left out more of as an oversight than as a feature. But when this happens, it results in users having to navigate through several kind of interfaces. Maybe they're copying and pasting a comment on your website. They have to memorize information and move it from one place to another. Now, this experience isn't great. It's requiring users to memorize information and use a lot of cognitive load when it actually is completely unnecessary for them to do so. I think there are very few situations in which cut, copy, and paste should not be included. And I think as much as possible, like, you should make sure that you have this. But as designers, to make sure that this isn't an oversight, indicate it in your designs. Remember, remind your dev team that we should have cut, copy, and paste as options at all times. Forcing users to do unnecessary tasks is also a thing that increases cognitive load. A really good example of that is in applications that require a security code to verify something. Very often this code will be sent to your text, and you will have to go to your texting app, grab that number, and pull it over to this application. Now, when you have to either memorize or bring this number over yourself, it's a lot of work to memorize that number, but also there's often a time limit associated with this task, which is even more stressful. In most situations, it's perfectly acceptable to have a feature that can auto-suggest like the most recent text message and let the user enter that number. Like, we have the technology, and it's a vastly better experience than a user having to jump between applications, memorize a number, and then bring it in before they run out of time. This is a legitimate issue, and I know some folks who have cognitive disabilities who often cannot complete these tasks in time to be verified on applications, for example. So this is a really important one, but a huge way to reduce cognitive load for your users. Avoiding infinite scroll and automatic page refresh is also a great way to reduce cognitive load. There are a lot of applications that exist right now, like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, that use this really dark pattern of infinite scrolling. And infinite scrolling, like, it's not great when you have content in the footer, for example, that users are never able to access, but also for users with certain cognitive disabilities, like maybe ADHD, there's almost a compulsion to continue scrolling, continue exploring content, even when the user maybe doesn't want to do that anymore. This kind of pattern isn't great and is not a very great experience for folks with different kinds of cognitive disabilities. A better experience might be, for example, to provide numbered screens or pages so that users can navigate through them at will. And so they're also aware of the separation of content and don't kind of fall down that vortex of doom scrolling for hours. Loading more is also a great option, again, to remind users that there is separation of content. Along with this pattern, we often also see automatic page refresh, which really sucks. You're scrolling through an app, you see some content you really like, and immediately you're sprung back up to the very top of the page. As much as possible, we should make sure that when we're refreshing content, that the user has like ample warning, but it's also a choice that they can make and not something that's done for them without any warning. So using common patterns in existing mental models is a great way of reducing cognitive load. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. If video players, of which there are many accessible and open source ones, exist, there is no need for you to redesign the pause, play, and fast forward methods and replace them with new symbols. You're adding cognitive load for people, and you're also making them memorize a new way of doing something that they already know how to do. So as much as possible, following existing patterns is really helpful for folks with cognitive disabilities. Using accessible videos and visuals to support content is a great way you can design for folks with cognitive disabilities. I think often people avoid visuals and video because they have heard that they need to make them accessible. It's kind of this misguided belief that by avoiding them altogether, you're making content more accessible, which actually isn't true. Having videos and visuals is a great way to like augment and support your content, but also support people with like a wide variety of like learning needs and people who process information differently. You just have to remember that when you use visuals and videos to like provide a transcript and closed captions in the case of video, or alternative text attributes in the case of visuals. But by no means does that mean that you need to stay away from them. They can actually be a really helpful tool for reducing cognitive load for people. Labeling icons. Now, I know that there are a lot of different schools of thought when it comes to this, especially for designers, but I am a big fan of labeling your icons. A really great example of why labeling your icons is important, I think we can see when we look at the symbols that you might find inside the label of a t-shirt, for example, giving you washing instructions. Now, looking at these symbols, a square with a black dot in the middle, an iron with one black dot, I personally find it pretty much impossible to understand what these mean. But if we label these icons, they become really helpful and they provide us with this really awesome essential information, but also a straightforward way to understand it. This is the way I like to think of labeling icons. I know that when we come across icons that we think are really common, like a clock with a refresh button, a heart icon, a little pin icon, we think that they're very straightforward for other people to understand. But often they might not be, but also thinking of people with a different cultural context than you, they might completely lose their meaning. If I'm from a country where shopping carts aren't very common and I see a shopping cart in your app, I have no idea what that means. But we can avoid that confusion by labeling icons and also reduce cognitive load for people who might be using your application for the first time or maybe just aren't familiar with the icons that you're using. But I will say that I've never been upset by seeing icons labeled, but I have had frustrating experiences where I've left applications because I don't understand what the icons mean. So that's a really helpful way to make sure that we reduce cognitive load, but also make our content accessible to like more people with different cultural contexts than us. Layouts. So layouts are another way in which we can reduce cognitive load. Using white space liberally is a very excellent way of reducing cognitive load when we're using it to like separate out content to make sure that we're creating kind of logical breaks in content and grouping them together. I know this one is a little bit less defined than maybe our other examples, but making sure that you have white space and are using it in an intentional way is usually a really great starting point. Dividing complex tasks into shorter and easier steps is also a great thing to do. When I'm designing a really complex flow, I like to use progressive disclosure to group similar concepts together, but make it so that the user isn't having to fill out this giant, huge, long form all at once. It might be nice in the sense that all your information is in one place, but it can also get really easily overwhelming for users. A really great example that I see out in the wild is with Wealthsimple's applications. Wealthsimple provides services for things like investing and stock market trading that most people find pretty kind of difficult to get into. So dividing their content and using progressive disclosure is a really helpful way to make a difficult concept more approachable for a variety of people. So dividing things into steps and indicating before the process begins what the different steps are, maybe indicating how long the steps will take and indicating what information the user will need to use for each step is a great way to like not only prepare a user for the flow that they're about to go through, but let them know ahead of time maybe how long it'll take, the kinds of information they need to gather, but makes it much less of a surprising process and thus reduces cognitive load because the user isn't anticipating what might come next, but they're kind of just guided through a flow that they're already aware of, like generally what it involves. Testing. So testing is a really great way to actually validate that what we're designing, what we're coming up with does reduce cognitive load, but not only that, that it's usable by a wide range of people. So testing with a variety of users, including people who are neurodivergent, is really important. I get questions really often about how do we make sure that we have neurodivergent people on our team? Now, making sure that that happens in the first place, like you have to take 10 steps back from this process and look at your application process in the first place. Chances are, if you're not implementing principles like this, or your application process itself isn't accessible, it's really unlikely you're going to have accessible people join your team, because they probably can't even apply for the job in the first place. So in order for this step to kind of work, you need to take a step back and make sure that the way to even access your company, access work at where you are, that process is accessible in the first place. Accessibility isn't just for customer facing stuff, like your things need to be accessible too. Otherwise, you are going to have a team full of people who kind of have the same experiences and don't kind of reflect the places you live and the diversity that exists. Hiring neurodivergent people, making sure that your application process, your interview process considers people with a range of abilities, but also applying these design principles to your application process, right? Making sure that you reduce cognitive load when interviewing people, making sure that they know the steps, progressively disclose to them like what each step of the interview process entails, right? These principles don't, again, just apply to design that's customer facing. It applies to like the design of your workspace in general. Creating more inclusive designs is the right thing to do, but it's also our job as designers and developers to make sure that your work will reach more people, that it's generally more enjoyable, and that you're not leaving a billion people in the world who live with disabilities out of the experiences that you're creating. It's our job, and looking at Wiki guidelines, like there's really no excuse to not be aware of this stuff. It's easy to reference, it's easy to find, and I guarantee you, if you have a question, there are other people who have the same question, and probably people who have thought about potential solutions to approaching these problems that you face. So today, in summary, we've talked about what cognitive disabilities are, and we've discussed a few different methods of improving experiences for people with cognitive disabilities, including using simple language, reducing cognitive load, using simple layouts, and testing with a variety of users. Again, I'd like to remind you that this list is in no way exhaustive, but these are some common things that I've come across in my experience that can be improved on the side of designers and developers. Thank you so much for attending my talk today. Really enjoyed sharing this with you all. And if you have any questions for me, we have a little question time coming up, but feel free to tweet me at Tolu_XYZ, and I'd be more than happy to kind of chat with you and answer any questions or chat with you about your own experiences.
Wow, that's a great talk, and the fact that you gave us a lot of great examples and allowed us to hear about your experiences. Thank you very much for doing that. And
For having me.
Tolu, I will tell you what, you in the chat, we've got people upvoting the fact that you're a horror fan and an accessibility designer. So get ready. I think you're going to have some more follows and people reaching out to you just because you got the right combination there. So I'm excited. I'm excited. So we've got a lot of questions that have come in. So how about you and I just kind of work through them and you give us your thoughts at them. And you know what? We're going to start at the beginning because I think you did a great job. You started this at the top of the page, right? Where everybody starts. And you started talking about page titles. And we had a question come in about what about when page titles are creative to attract the audience? But then how is that descriptive? How do you mix that that title that's supposed to be creative, but at the same time descriptive? Do you have thoughts around that?
That's a really good question. So I've definitely encountered articles like that where the page title is like maybe a little bit more creative, doesn't directly reference what's happening on the page. I think there's an opportunity there to maybe use a subheading, for example, to in clearer words explain what's going on that page, but also in the meta information of the page, there's an opportunity to use a more straightforward way of describing it. So maybe your post is about what the heck happened last week in the show Raised by Wolves. Maybe in the title you say review of episode 5 season 9 of Raised by Wolves, and then the title, right? Like there are ways to give a little bit more context before having that creative title that might leave out too much information for some people to fully understand it.
Good way of thinking of it, that you can just provide that additional information in that subtitle. That's great. So you also talked about using simple language, which is very important to people who are neurodivergent. How would you go about ensuring that the language is simple, but not belittling to the user?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The way that I like to generally think of it is think about how I speak in everyday life to my friends. I think a lot of the time the content we see online uses this language that's like not really how people speak in the real world, but I think trying to have more conversational language is a great way to start. Like I rarely feel like I end up with content that's hard to digest when I just think that I'm talking to a good friend instead of approaching it from another angle. I think making sure that something sounds like natural language is a great place to start. But there are also programs online that actually you can copy and paste your content into, and they will look at it for you and give you an estimated reading level. So that's also a great way to get better at that. I feel like it's definitely a skill to hone, though. I definitely admit that sometimes I tend to create articles that use this language that no one actually uses.
Well, and I think it's a great point that, you know, you're talking to people. So think, hey, I'm talking to one of my friends. How can I best convey that information to my friend in everyday conversation? Because I think, you know, we just remember that there's another person on the other side of that screen. I think it's a great suggestion to just keep that in mind. So we do talk about grade level, and someone came up with a very interesting question because sometimes we need legal and compliance language on our pages, right? Someone taps us on the shoulder and say, you know what, you need this language on your page. But how would you go about convincing those departments that they need to write it at a grade 8 level and not just immediately get into some terms that might be more confusing for someone?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. I am no lawyer, so I can't like definitively tell you what to
Mhm.
do. This is not legal advice, but I would say that these like accessibility guidelines apply across the board, right? So like using conversational language is also important when we're talking about legal terms. Like I talked about in the presentation, I think sometimes there are inherently terms that are difficult to understand, that are just part of the jargon of this field. But in those situations, I think defining those terms can be a really huge help. But definitely like accessibility laws don't just apply to like websites, like they do apply across all different disciplines. So it's important for even legal folks to recognize that they are held to a certain standard when it comes to making their content accessible.
Yeah, it sounds like education is key, right? Because we've got those, and maybe some people are not aware. Hey, this is something you should be doing. You mentioned just a few minutes ago, right, that there are tools out there that can help us check simple language. Do you have any suggestions for our attendees on some of those tools that you use that you found have been really helpful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually didn't include any in my presentation because I was actually really struggling to find websites that do this that are also accessible. So I'll kind of like flip that question around on the folks here. I'm sure there are some content folks or other people who use software like this. If you have any examples of software like this that's accessible, like please share with us. I would also love to know. Yeah, it's surprisingly difficult to find software that does this. It's also accessible.
Great, great. Yeah, point. Great point. So we need to make sure that they're both, right? That the people they are accessible and that we can get to them as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So you talked about disabled buttons, and I would have been surprised had I not seen anything in the chat about disabled buttons.
Yeah.
So one person asks, you know, can you expand on why disabled buttons are overused and maybe some alternatives that could be explored in the avenue of disabled buttons?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think disabled buttons are overused because they are used a lot in the context of like submission forms, right? When you're trying to submit a form and it ends with a disabled button that you can't interact with, it's difficult or impossible for a user to get feedback about why they can't submit the input. Now that's problematic because when there's an error on the page that the user can't submit and they also don't get feedback about the error, they are left to kind of parse through the information to figure out what's wrong. And sometimes it's difficult to spot, but it's also asking a lot of the person to like dedicate all these cognitive resources to figure out why something is not, you can't submit it. Like I've been on websites that ask for a password and they have these rules like one uppercase, one lowercase. And
Mhm,
if the website isn't telling me why I don't fit that criteria, it's gonna be
mhm.
really difficult for me to parse through all their rules and figure it out myself. So hopefully that helps understand why they're problematic. I think they're overused because almost always it's a better alternative to let the user select that submit button, but then don't submit and tell them why they can't submit. So not only have you showed them that like submitting is an option when things are correct, but then you go back and guide them through the process of what they need to fix and show them that they can submit once they do that. So I think giving the user a path to learning and to fixing things is always better than just kind of shutting them out and not telling them why they're being shut out.
Back to your thoughts of giving them that positive feedback and not always smacking their hand when they do something wrong.
Exactly.
That's a great point. So you gave us an example about disabled and ARIA disabled. Would you suggest using ARIA disabled queue over always having a button be enabled? And we really talked about that, right? And your thoughts behind that is, let's enable that button. Let's give that user feedback. In any kind of user experiences, have you seen more of a positive experience from the feedback that you've gotten from neurodivergent people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say that with this kind of thing, like I never want to be prescriptive to designers and developers. Like I recognize that we're all professionals who encounter different situations. Like it really is impossible for me to sit here and think of all the possible like situations that occur. So I don't want to give hard and fast rules about disabled buttons. So I recommend that most of the time we not use them because most of the time I find that they are not necessary. I rarely come across instances where they are. But if you determine that for your application it is necessary, then like the way to do it accessibly is by having that ARIA disabled attribute. And I think that's like a great way to think about making like reusable patterns. Don't try to think of every single situation, but like give people the tools to make the best experience that they can. And sorry, can you remind me of the second part of the question?
It's really more of a have you seen that experience with some
Oh
of
yeah.
the usability testing that you have? And it sounds like personally you've really seen that be a positive impact for people trying to use the form versus just getting frustrated and wondering why a certain button doesn't work, right? What am
Yeah.
I doing wrong?
Yeah,
Kind of a
like
situation.
doing testing with users, there's often scenarios where they're trying to do something on a page, but they don't know why they're not able to. So like scrolling through the page, like looking for error messages is a common response. But in the case of a disabled button, that's not really present on that page. So like users can very easily get frustrated or just leave the page altogether if they determine that there's no easy path forward. And that's not an ideal situation.
So I love your clothing example because I agree with you. Sometimes it's like reading hieroglyphs and saying, I have no idea what I need to do with this piece of clothing to get
Yeah.
it to work.
Yeah.
And someone asked about how do we balance that labeling icons versus avoiding small text, right? Because by putting it next to that icon, you might get into that slippery slope of trying to save screen real estate with the labeling. So how do you see us balancing those two of text size and labeling those icons?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So this is I think like a school of thought that like is really helpful to look at from a content design perspective. I think there's definitely like always that tension between using the right icon but providing text that's like not too long but also provides enough information. I definitely don't think there's like a straightforward hard and fast rule about the best way to do it, but I do think it's an important part of the design process to like sit down and iterate about the best combinations and trying our best not to sacrifice the important things. I think for the vast majority of applications, like things like home, profile, settings, those are really common patterns that we see that can probably be easily reused. But when we're thinking of adding new patterns, I think then is the time to like really sit down and like consider what the trade-offs are. But definitely it's not always easy, especially when we're coming up with new icons and like settings, for sure.
So here we go. I think that's a great, you're reading my sheet for the next question. So I think you set us up for the next question perfectly. Do you have a suggestion for a new save icon that isn't a floppy disk? So no one under 30 years old has ever used a floppy disk, so they have no idea what that's supposed to mean. Have you found an icon or a pattern that works for that? That's
Oh,
not
that's
necessarily a save.
That's a really good question. It's a really interesting question. Like we have to think about like one, not reinventing the wheel, but
Yes.
two, also providing enough context for people to understand things. I don't think I have a good answer for that right off the top of my head. Like I would love to see people's suggestions about this. Honestly, I'm vaguely familiar with floppy disks, so they work for me, but that's a really good point. Like I definitely would be curious to see what other people are thinking of, but right now I honestly can't think of a really good, simple to understand, easily depicted icon. So yeah, that's definitely.
I think it's time to band together and come up with a better pattern on that
I
one, right?
totally
So
agree.
for
Our
the
next,
next generation. All
yeah.
right. So how do you work with designers that won't use icon labels because it's cleaner, it's less cluttered, even when you bring up those accessibility issues. So
Yeah.
you get a little resistance into some of the practices you've talked
Yeah.
to us about today.
That's a really great question. Often, like a big part of accessibility is stakeholder management, right? Like, how do you convince the other people on your team to take an approach that you think is better? I think a really helpful thing to do is like provide actual feedback from like the users, like talking to users and really showing examples of people struggling with those icons and trying to figure out like what they mean. I think is a really great way of like not just telling designers but proving to them why using certain icons are not accessible. I think if you are telling people and giving them evidence and they're still not believing you, then maybe like confronting them with like a video of a user going through the interface and struggling might be another great tool to use to kind of illustrate your point.
So one of the things that you talked about is cut, paste, and copy. And an individual just wanted to ask, right? Do you know of any research that shows that cut, paste field options isn't a security risk? And they're asking because they want to make sure that they've got data that they convince the devs that copy paste option is necessarily not a risk. Do you know of
Yeah,
anything out there that can help support that even further as we try to build that knowledge?
that's a really great question. There's actually like a large body of evidence when it comes to like just addressing the way we think about passwords overall. I think one of the reasons that copy and paste becomes important in password fields is because there are these wild requirements for passwords nowadays, like one
Mhm.
uppercase, one lowercase, one exclamation mark, no commas. Like people need to use copy and paste because they can't remember all this information. But like research actually shows that using like three words that maybe have nothing to do with one another in a password is just as effective, if not more effective than all these like wild requirements that we use. So maybe we take a step back and even look at the requirements that we're looking at, like it becomes easier for users to even be able to interact with this. But when it comes to like the actual copying and pasting, yeah, absolutely. Like looking at applications that are secure, like 1Password, for example, like
Mhm.
they enable you to copy and paste your password into a field proven to be super secure. So I'd look into things like that. Like one, looking at applications that enable you to do this, but two, also looking at the password requirements that result in such a high cognitive load that users need to copy and paste their passwords in the first place.
Yep. Well, and I think also, Tulu, I would even argue it's more secure because it allows me to use not the same password over and over again, but to kind of mix it up even as a user, just because, if you use 1Password for everything, I put myself at a security risk. And by enabling me to be able to do that, like you said, there's a lot of best practices now that are showing that helps security, doesn't hurt security. So I
Yeah.
think that's your example of some of the password managers, I think is a great example that we could use for devs to understand. Hey, do you use a password manager? Well, that does that, and you can see how more secure that is. So great idea with that. Great idea with that. And a good example that we're all familiar with. So a couple people have asked about your idea around neurodivergence on our team. And one person wanted to know, what suggestions would you have to protect people from cognitive disabilities from discrimination in the workplace? So we've got them on our teams and we want to protect them. And we want to also normalize their participation versus other performers, right? So we've hired someone who's neurodivergent on our team. We want to make them part of the workplace and not necessarily a person that's just there for that. What suggestions would you have for that?
That's a really great question. As someone who's neurodivergent myself, sometimes navigating accommodation at work can be really difficult or like downright humiliating and frustrating. I think processes that require like a burden of evidence that someone has to provide in order to get accommodation, like instantly like leave out a lot of people or make it something that's like kind of shameful. Like I have to get a letter from my doctor and I have to show it to this person. I have to prove to this person that I have a disability that's worthy of accommodation. But I think really like taking a different approach to accommodation is something that is helpful to explore at workplaces. If someone comes to you and says that they need an accommodation, they probably do, whether or not they can prove their disability or not, right? Like I think entering the conversation about accommodations and disability with like a much more generous stance is always a good way to approach things. Whether someone needs, I don't know, access to a screen reader on their work computer because they have a cognitive disability or because it just makes their lives easier, I think it's worthwhile accommodating that person because they're better able to perform their duties with that support. So I think just changing the even like approach to disability accommodations is a great way to start, and not making it a process that someone has to like prove something to you before you help them, but like listening to someone that says they need help and trying to work out with them like what's most meaningful and the best way you can support them like within your means, and then taking the conversation from there.
Great thoughts. Great thoughts. And when we're testing with designs with neurodivergent participants, are there some methodologies to use to do this to make sure we're getting maximum value for them and us? Or are there just common practices that you would use with any kind of user testing that you've incorporated in testing with individuals?
That's a great question. So as far as testing with people with disabilities, like I do like to use like standard testing practices, but I also really just like to like ask the person what would be easiest for them, what they need, how they like navigate situations. Like even if we do have a set of standard practices, disabilities affects people so differently. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to go like by one standard code book. Like I would just ask the person what's easiest for them, and I often end up learning a lot when I just kind of like sit down with a person and like, so what would you like to do? Like, what do you typically do? And I feel like that's such a great place for insights, like letting the person lead the conversation and respond as opposed to like going in with a set of assumptions.
All right, so I'm going to break the moderator rule. I'm going to throw you a curveball here because it's asked, and I really think it's an important question. What's your favorite all-time horror movie?
Oh, this is a good one. I don't know if I could like choose one necessarily. Like I find myself rewatching It Follows a lot.
Yeah.
There's just something really cool about a horror movie that just like uses regular people. But also I would say Evil Dead, not the like Sam Raimi one, but like the revisit with the creepy tone is really, I think it's really good and really underrated. Yeah, those are ones I find rewatching. I've rewatched each probably about 4 times. I think
I,
those are
th-
really
I, I think we found a connoisseur. So if nothing else, follow Tulu so you can get the taste of where you need to look at for your
cool.
genre. So
Let's chat
fantastic.
horror movies. Also, The Nun. The Nun is a really good one. There's something really unsettling about a demon wearing a nun costume, but yeah, I could go on for this.
So we're running out of time. I want to give you a little bit of time yourself, just to one closing thought from you of things that we need to be thinking about as we're designing for neurodivergent people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best thing to do is to just like interact with people who have disabilities, like follow people with disabilities on Twitter, listen to what they have to say, interact with people with disabilities, just surround yourself with people who have different experiences. Like it's such an amazing way of learning like the day-to-day experiences of different folks.
I can't thank you enough for your time, for this session, for answering the questions. This was just a great session. Had a lot of fun with it. Thank you to everybody attending. A friendly reminder, you can come back and watch this recording at any time. Share this conversation with your friends because I think this has been a great conversation on a topic that necessarily we all don't focus in on. Thank you for sharing your experience and thank you for sharing our time with us. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of AXCon. Thank you very much and have a great day today.
Thank you.